My name is Michael. I am 42 years old, and I have been married for 18 years to an amazing woman named Sarah. In all these years, if there is one thing I have learned, it is that marriage is not just about love or passion. It is about constant hard work, the ability to compromise, and the desire to support each other in every moment of life. Sarah and I have always been able to do that. All in all, I always thought we were doing well. We live in a quiet neighborhood in upstate New York, in a small house with a well-kept garden and an old oak tree in the yard. We bought this house shortly after we were married, when Sarah had just finished medical school and I had started working as an engineer. We have 3 children, and each of them is our little world. Emma, the oldest, who is 16, has inherited all the best qualities from Sarah. Her ability to set goals and achieve them, her confidence and drive to be the best at what she does. She's always been a diligent student, but she's trying especially hard now, since she's only a couple years away from graduation. Oliver, who is 14, is more like me. He is calm, sensible, loves technology, and is already interested in engineering. He and I often spend our evenings building things in the garage or discussing the latest technical innovations. And Lily is our youngest. She is 10. She is a ray of light in our house, always cheerful and cheerful. She loves animals and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Sometimes in the morning, she comes to my kitchen to help me cook breakfast, and these moments fill me with special tenderness. Life went on as it should. Sarah is a successful doctor working at a local clinic. She is often praised by her patients, which is no surprise. She knows how to be sensitive and attentive, always knows how to help and support. During our years together, I have seen how much effort she puts into her work, how sincerely she cares for each patient, and this has always made me proud. My job as an engineer for a large construction company takes up most of my day, but I have always tried to spend as much time with my family as possible. Sarah and I knew how important it was to maintain a work-life balance, especially when we have 3 children. We divided up responsibilities so that we each had time for ourselves and our families. In the evenings, we would all have dinner together, discussing how the day went. Weekends were our family days. Sometimes we went for walks to the forest park. Sometimes we just watched movies as a family at home. Everything was great. We went through a lot. Problems at work, the children's health, financial difficulties, all these things only strengthened us. Even in those moments when we had disagreements, we always found common ground. During these 18 years, our marriage seemed to me an indestructible fortress. But something started to change recently. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was my fatigue, or maybe it was just that I'd been immersed in my work for too long. Sarah started staying late at work a lot, citing unscheduled meetings or emergencies. I understood that she had a stressful job and didn't ask too many questions. However, after a few weeks, I began to notice odd little things. She was constantly texting someone on the phone, and it started happening more and more often, even during dinners or family nights. When I would ask who it was, she would say it was work stuff or talking to her friends. I tried to reassure myself that everything was normal, but the anxiety started to build up. Sometimes she would leave the house without explanation, saying she had to meet someone for business, but wouldn't go into details. A few days after I first noticed the change in Sarah's behavior, the anxiety began to build. It started with little things, the kind of things that could easily be blamed on fatigue, business, or simple necessity. I tried to reassure myself that perhaps I had simply become too attentive to her actions, but with each passing day, my doubts only grew stronger. Sarah used to always share her plans. She would tell me when she needed to stay late at work or when she was going to meet up with her friends. We didn't keep strict records of each other's every move, but we always knew who was doing what, and it created a sense of confidence and trust. Lately, however, she had become much less talkative. Sometimes she would leave in the morning and not tell me when she would be back. If I asked, she would say something like, "Oh, it's just work," or "meeting the girls." She wouldn't give details and seemed to do so with intent, as if she didn't care that I knew where she was. The phone became another important detail. It used to be her normal means of communication, and she could leave it safely on her desk, not caring who was texting her. But now the phone was practically out of her hands. When it started vibrating or ringing, she would immediately pick it up, look at the messages, sometimes reply briefly, sometimes go into another room to talk. This was new. She had never done this before. I felt like she was hiding something, and it made me nervous. One evening, as the kids and I were sitting on the couch watching a family movie, her phone rang. She immediately got up and headed into the bedroom, taking the phone with her. I could feel the irritation starting to boil up inside of me. Why couldn't she answer the phone right there? Who was she talking to if she needed privacy? The movie continued, but I could no longer focus on what was happening on the screen. My head was occupied with only one question: what was going on with Sarah? These calls and texts were happening regularly. Sometimes she said they were colleagues or patients needing urgent advice. I knew that her job sometimes required these unscheduled contacts, but it happened too often. At night, she could wake up to the vibrating of her phone, pick it up, and quietly retire to another room. Her sleep used to be sound, and no call could wake her up so easily. Now, however, it seemed as if she was waiting for those messages. One occasion was particularly memorable. It was on a Saturday night. We were going to a friend's house for dinner, but an hour before we had to leave, Sarah said she had to meet a coworker at work right away. Just for a couple hours, she added with her usual lightness in her voice, like it was something normal. I agreed, though I was already growing irritated inside. She left, and I stayed home with the kids. Dinner at a friend's house had to be canceled because I couldn't leave them alone. When Sarah returned, it was almost midnight. She looked tired, but was smiling as if the day had gone beautifully. "How was the meeting?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "Oh, it was fine," she replied, as if it wasn't worth any discussion. No details, no explanation as to why the meeting dragged on all evening. She kissed my cheek and headed for the shower, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I tried not to jump to conclusions. After all, Sarah had always been honest with me. But now I was beginning to notice that her honesty seemed to have evaporated somewhere. She became more silent, avoiding open conversations. Her eyes often looked away when I started asking questions about her meetings or who was writing to her. Once I even tried to peek over her shoulder as she typed a message, but she immediately took her phone aside as if hiding the screen. It was so unfamiliar, I couldn't help but take notice. Week after week, the feeling that I was missing something important grew stronger. Sarah was no longer the open woman I'd known her to be all these years. There was a tension between us. It was invisible, but you could feel it. I tried not to show that it bothered me. Maybe I was being overly sensitive. Maybe it was just a phase in our relationship where everyone needed their own space. These thoughts kept me on my toes. I was lost between trust and suspicion. One evening, as I lay in bed, Sarah left the room again to answer the phone. This time I couldn't help myself. I quietly got up and followed her. She closed herself in the living room, and I could hear her muffled voice through the door. I couldn't make out the words, but her tone wasn't what it usually was when she was talking to coworkers or friends. There was some nervousness in her voice. I felt my heart clench in my chest. Was everything that seemed so stable and solid starting to crumble? I went back to the bedroom, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I really was getting myself worked up for nothing. But the anxiety continued to weigh on me. The inner voice I usually tried to ignore grew louder. It didn't overtly accuse me, but it asked too many questions. From then on, my nights became restless. I tossed and turned in bed for long periods of time, listening to every sound, every rustle. I tried to convince myself that Sarah was just tired, that work had really gotten more stressful for her, that she wouldn't hide anything important. But with each new night, that certainty grew weaker and weaker. Suspicions began to fill my head like water fills cracks in a rock, and the longer I tried to convince myself that this was just a temporary phase, the deeper those cracks got. It all started one rainy night. I was sitting in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, looking out the window at the streams of water running down the glass, when Sarah, hurriedly dressed again, announced that she had to go to an unscheduled meeting for work. Her voice sounded as calm as it had the previous times, but this time something changed in me. I could no longer just sit there and watch her walk away without explanation. The inner feelings of jealousy and mistrust that I tried to drown out up until then flared up with renewed vigor. I could no longer reassure myself that it was just my imagination. There were too many little things that didn't add up, too many mysterious actions. I felt like if I didn't figure out what was going on, I was just going to go insane. "Don't wait up for me. I don't know how long this will take," she tossed, quickly pulling on her jacket and throwing on a scarf. I nodded, trying to look indifferent, like I wasn't bothered by her next absence. But inside me, everything was boiling. As soon as I heard the door slam and her footsteps fade downstairs, I jumped up from my chair. I couldn't stand this state of uncertainty any longer. I had to find out the truth. I dressed quickly and followed her out, carefully closing the door behind me. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but at that moment the only way out seemed to be to follow her. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe it was wrong. But I could no longer stand this feeling that she was getting further away from me every day, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. By the time I got outside, Sarah had already managed to get into the car. I barely made it in time, but I noticed her car driving off into the distance. My heart was racing, and I didn't hesitate to get in my car and follow her. The road was wet from the rain, the windshield wipers squeaking on the windshield, but I kept my eyes on her car, trying to keep my distance. I didn't want her to notice me. That night was the first of the night I was determined to find out where she was going and what she was hiding. We drove through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, and I kept thinking that maybe she really was heading to a work meeting. Maybe I'm just overreacting. But my doubts slammed into me again when she turned not toward the hospital where she worked, but into a neighborhood we rarely visited. My heart beat faster and faster, the tension increasing with each new turn of her car. She parked at a small cafe on the corner of the street. The place wasn't unfamiliar to me, but I knew for a fact that she never mentioned it in her conversations about meeting coworkers. I parked a few meters away from her, cautiously watching as she got out of the car. Sarah looked tired but determined. She took a quick step towards the entrance of the cafe without looking back. I stayed in the car, watching to see what would happen next. A few minutes later, another figure approached the cafe, a tall one in a business suit. At first I thought it was one of her coworkers, perhaps really a work meeting. But the figure approached the door, and as the person stepped inside, I thought it was a man. My breathing quickened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I sat in the car, hesitant to get out and follow. If it was a coworker, why was she hiding all this so carefully? I spent about an hour watching the cafe. There was no suspicious movement. Inside, outside the window, I could see their silhouettes sitting at a table. They were talking, but because of the rain, I couldn't see their faces or understand what they were saying. However, the thought never left me that this wasn't just a business meeting. When Sarah finally came out, it was already nighttime. I saw her hug her companion with a smile, and then she quickly got into her car and drove away. The next morning, I tried to talk to her about the meeting, asking who she was with, but Sarah's response was as brief as ever, with a coworker. No details, no attempt to explain. My jealousy only grew stronger. I could feel the wall of distrust growing between us more and more. It had been a long time since we had discussed our days and our thoughts the way we used to. She had become more closed off, and it made me fear losing her. The next night, I decided to be even more determined. I followed her again as soon as she announced a work meeting. But this time things went differently. Sarah headed in the opposite direction to an office building downtown. I parked nearby and watched as she went inside. Expecting it to be something trivial, I began to doubt my suspicions again. Maybe I was suspecting her for nothing. But the longer I watched, the stronger my feeling became that this was all wrong. One day when Sarah said she had to meet her friends, I went to pick her up again. This time she did meet up with her friends, and I felt silly, deciding I was probably winding myself up. They sat in a cafe, talking and laughing. Nothing suspicious, but I felt uneasy. Was it really that simple, or was Sarah just skillfully hiding her real motives? My attempts to expose her continued. I watched her every move, but I couldn't find anything to confirm my suspicions. My nightly raids led me to a dead end. All her meetings were either work or with her friends. But the feeling of unease hasn't gone away. That inner feeling that something important was eluding me kept me on my toes. I knew I couldn't rest until I found out the whole truth. A few weeks after I'd started following Sarah, I'd almost convinced myself that all my suspicions were just a mind game. But then came the incident that reignited all my anxieties. It had been a week since I'd started following Sarah, and although my observations hadn't yet yielded any concrete evidence of her infidelity, my inner unease was only growing. Everything seemed too perfect, and situations like this don't usually leave a trace. Sarah continued to go out with her friends, work late into the night, and hold meetings with coworkers who, at first glance, had nothing suspicious to say. But one day everything changed. It was a normal evening, and Sarah again said she needed to meet with coworkers after work. I had just about calmed down and was beginning to slowly let go of my paranoid thoughts. That evening, I decided to follow her more out of inertia than out of any real need. To be honest, I was getting tired of my own attempts to discover things, but I couldn't completely give up. My heart was still clinging to the idea that I was missing something important. I got in the car again and followed her. We drove down familiar streets, but this time the route was different. Instead of heading to a familiar cafe or restaurant, Sarah turned into a neighborhood I hadn't seen her in before. It was a small, cozy cafe on the street corner, a place she and I had frequented before when we had more time for each other. The place gave me a slight nostalgic feeling. I parked nearby and watched as usual. After a few minutes, I saw her get out of the car, look around, and quickly head towards the entrance. So far, it was business as usual. But after a few minutes, two people approached the cafe, and I recognized them instantly. They were John and Mark, old friends of mine. We'd been friends for years, but we'd seen each other less and less lately due to busy work and family matters. I couldn't understand what Sarah was doing with them. Why was she meeting with them, and not her coworkers like she said she would? And more importantly, why had she kept this meeting from me? At that moment, my doubts flared up with renewed vigor. What kind of business could my wife have with my friends that I didn't know about? I felt a chill run down my spine. They entered the cafe together, and I continued to watch from the car, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Inside the cafe, they sat at a table by the window. I could see them talking and laughing and acting like it was just a normal reunion of friends. But then why didn't Sarah tell me about this meeting? What exactly was she discussing with them? My thoughts began to churn. I tried to think of a logical explanation, but nothing came to mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a chance encounter. As I watched them, everything seemed perfectly normal. The conversation, the laughter, the gestures. They were clearly at ease. John was saying something, and all three of them were laughing. I began to wonder if this was just a friendly encounter, and I was exaggerating again. But then something happened that made me tense up even more. As the meeting came to an end, Sarah stood up, hugged first John and then Mark, and kissed them both on the cheek. It was a seemingly ordinary gesture of goodbye, but it felt extraordinarily intimate to me. It was more than just saying goodbye to friends. At that moment, my heart clenched. I couldn't believe my eyes. Why was she suddenly so close to them? Why hadn't she mentioned a word about them? She used to tell me about any encounters, even the most insignificant ones, and now these moments were happening behind my back. I felt anxiety rising in my soul, turning to anger. What could they be discussing? Why were they all together, and why was this happening in secret from me? Perhaps I was right after all. Something was clearly lurking behind those smiles and jokes. I fought myself, trying to remain objective, but it all seemed too strange. My wife couldn't just be in the company of my friends without telling me. As Sarah got into her car and drove away, I was left sitting in mine, immersed in my thoughts. I had known John and Mark for years. We'd been through a lot together, and I never thought they could have been involved in something like this. But then why were they going out with Sarah without me? I ran through possible explanations in my head, but each one seemed weak and implausible. The more I thought about it, the more my disbelief grew. That night I couldn't sleep. My head was filled with thoughts of what had happened in the cafe. I had seen it with my own eyes, but I still couldn't believe it. Maybe I had missed something important. Maybe this encounter was just the tip of the iceberg. With each passing day, I felt like I was losing control of the situation. My trust in Sarah and in my friends began to crumble like a house of cards. Everything that had seemed stable and secure to me before was now shaky and fragile. I didn't know what to do next. On the one hand, I still had no proof of the affair, but on the other hand, this meeting seemed too strange to ignore. What could my friends have to do with my wife? Why were they suddenly so close? These questions kept me on my toes. I knew I couldn't just let it go. I had to find out the truth, whatever it was. The next few days passed in suspense. I tried to act normal, but I was seething inside. I could no longer look at Sarah in peace. Every look she gave me, every move she made seemed suspicious. I wanted to ask her directly what she was doing with John and Mark, but I knew she would either find an explanation or just avoid answering. I felt I had to proceed carefully so as not to scare her off. If something was really going on behind my back, I needed proof. This was the moment when my suspicions peaked. I was on the edge, between jealousy, distrust, and fear. The only question was how far I was willing to go to find out the truth. When I found out that I was to go to another city for work for a couple days, my anxiety went to a new level. In normal times, such a business trip would have been routine for me, but now things were different. My thoughts returned again and again to what I'd seen in the cafe. Sarah hugging John and Mark, her laughter, the ease with which she said goodbye to them, as if it wasn't me, her husband, but someone else, someone closer to her. My inner tension only increased as I packed for the trip. Every time I put a shirt or pants in my suitcase, I imagined how Sarah would take advantage of my absence. As soon as I left, she'd be off to meet up with one of them, either John or Mark, maybe even both of them. The thoughts lingered in my head like a thorn in my side, not letting me rest for a moment. Before I left, I tried to act normal. In the morning, at breakfast, I tried to look calm and at ease, but I was seething inside. Sarah was smiling as she served me coffee, telling me how she was going to spend time with the kids while I was gone. Everything seemed perfectly normal, too normal, but now I couldn't look at her with the same confidence I had before. I could feel my heart speed up whenever she said something or smiled. What if there was something else behind that smile? When I left for work that day, just before my trip, we stood at the door saying our usual goodbyes. I hugged her, she pressed against me, and for a moment I felt the warmth of her body. That moment should have calmed me down, but instead I only sank deeper into doubt. Her embrace seemed to me like something she was doing mechanically. Maybe she was already thinking about what she would do when I wasn't around. I got in my car and drove to the airport. The drive seemed endless and my thoughts seemed heavy. As I drove, my imagination kept me busy. I imagined Sarah sitting at a table with John and Mark, them laughing together about something, her reaching out to touch their arm or shoulder. I knew all these thoughts were a product of my jealousy, but there was no getting rid of them. In these thoughts, I saw not just possible infidelity, but the destruction of everything I had built all these years. When I finally got to the airport and went through security, I tried to distract myself to switch to work. I grabbed my laptop and opened my email and started writing business emails, but even that didn't help. Every time the screen went dark, reflecting my own face, I saw it as a man losing control of his life. A man who couldn't trust his own wife. The flight to the other city passed in a similar state. I was sitting in my seat, looking out the window at the passing clouds, but mentally I was far away from here. I kept running scenarios in my head of what might be happening back home while I was away. Sarah laughing with John and Mark. Sarah possibly even meeting them at our house, our family nest. That thought hit me the hardest, that they could be in our home, the very place where we built our lives, where we raised our children, where we shared our most intimate moments. When I arrived immersed in work, I tried to focus on meetings and business negotiations, but every time I had free time, my thoughts returned to Sarah. In the evenings after a long day of work, I would sit in my hotel room, staring at the screen of my phone. I wanted to call her, to ask her how she was doing, but I held back. I knew that if I started this conversation, I wouldn't be able to resist and would start asking questions that would give away my distrust. I checked her social media, trying to find even the slightest hint of what she was doing. She posted the usual stuff, pictures of her kids, posts about work, but it didn't reassure me. I thought it was just a disguise. Maybe she's putting it out there so I won't guess what's really going on. Each night at the hotel, I lay in bed contemplating what might have happened in my absence. My thoughts took the darkest turns. I imagined Sarah opening the door to John or Mark, them entering our house, her pouring wine for them sitting together in our living room, laughing and acting as if I had never existed in her life. This image kept me going, and the more I tried to push these thoughts away, the more they came back. One night, I even started contemplating going back early. I could just take a ticket on the first morning flight and be home in a few hours. But what would that solve? I was afraid that if I arrived early, I wouldn't find what I expected, and my suspicions would only deepen. It was a game of my own mind, and I could no longer tell exactly where was reality and where was my fantasy. On the second day of the business trip, I was on edge. I hardly slept at all. My work was going badly because I couldn't concentrate on anything but Sarah. When negotiations were over and I got back to the hotel, I sat on the bed again, looking at my phone. Her name popped up on the screen. Sarah had texted to say that everything was fine, that the kids missed me, that she was waiting for my return. She acted like everything was fine, but I couldn't believe it anymore. I answered her briefly, trying not to give away my excitement. But in the back of my mind, I had already made up my mind. Tomorrow morning, as soon as my business trip was over, I would return home and find out the truth. I couldn't wait any longer. I knew I couldn't live my life in peace until I found out what was going on behind my back. This path I had embarked on had no turning back. Returning home after 2 days of a harrowing business trip, I felt a heaviness building up in my chest. All this time, I was like a cage of my own thoughts and doubts. Every minute away from Sarah felt like an eternity, and images of her spending time with John or Mark never left my mind. I had lived those 2 days in a state of anxiety and paranoia, and now back home, I was determined to find out the truth once and for all. At the airport, waiting for my flight, I looked at the messages from Sarah. She wrote to me every day, seemingly unsuspecting. "How was your day? The kids miss you. We're waiting for you to come home." But in those innocent words, I could no longer see anything but veiled deception. Maybe she was just covering herself with these messages to distract me from what was really going on. I felt that if I didn't take drastic action, this feeling of suspicion would haunt me forever. Sitting on the plane on the way back, I made a final decision. I could no longer live in a state of uncertainty. I didn't want to guess and agonize any longer. The only way to end this was to catch Sarah in the act if my suspicions were confirmed. I didn't just need to know the truth, I needed proof. Clear, irrefutable, so that if anything happened, she couldn't get away with it. The idea of using the camera seemed logical and even liberating. I thought it would give me confidence. With a camera, I would record everything that happened, and then no one would be able to deny the obvious. After getting off the plane, I got into my car and drove home. On the way, I imagined several times what I would say to Sarah if I saw her with someone else. I was filled with emotions: anger, fear, disappointment. But amidst all these thoughts, a sense of control grew. I was prepared for what I would see at home, and I was going to act decisively. The closer I drove to her house, the harder my heart beat. My hands were sweating, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. I turned onto our street, pulled in front of the house, and saw that all the curtains were tightly closed. That alarmed me. Usually Sarah always left the curtains slightly ajar, especially during the day. Maybe she was hiding something inside. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and turned on the camera. With trembling hands, I started recording, hoping I had the strength to keep my composure if my suspicions were confirmed. As I pulled up to the house, I turned off the engine and quietly got out of the car. Standing on the sidewalk, I took a deep breath and walked to the door. Questions swirled in my head. What would I see behind that door? Would I be able to endure if my worst fears came true? I'd seen this moment in my mind 100 times before, how I'd walk in and find Sarah with another man. But this time, it was real. I walked slowly to the door and took hold of the handle and opened it sharply. My plan was simple: to walk into the house with my camera at the ready and film everything that was going on in there without warning. I wanted to see everything with my own eyes, not to miss anything. Bursting into the house with phone in hand, I was ready to capture every moment, whether it was her cheating or something else. It was now or never. I gathered my thoughts, pulled the front door handle sharply, and walked into the house. But what I saw was totally unexpected. I was standing in the doorway of our house, still holding my camera phone in my hand, when I was hit with a loud and synchronized, "Happy birthday, Michael." A loud chorus of voices pierced the silence, and for a second I literally froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. The house, which I suspected to be the scene of betrayal, was brightly lit and decorated, with balloons and banners everywhere that read, "Happy Birthday," and "Welcome Home." The room had an atmosphere of cheer and warmth, leaving no room for my dark fantasies. My wife, Sarah, stood right in front of me, radiant and glowing with happiness, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She looked at me with such genuine joy, as if she had just waited for the moment to see my reaction. Standing next to her were our children, Emma, Oliver, and Lily, all dressed up, with smiles stretching from ear to ear. They waved to me, holding clappers in their hands, ready to celebrate the moment. It was a moment I could have easily missed because of my own fears and suspicions. With my gaze, I quickly ran my eyes around the room and was amazed at the number of people. Not only were my close friends here, but also people I hadn't seen in years. John and Mark, whom I had recently suspected of something untoward, were standing in the very center with glasses of champagne, laughing and waving at me. I barely held back a nervous chuckle, remembering my recent thoughts about them. It all seemed ridiculous and ridiculous now, but back then my suspicions had seemed so real. By the fireplace, I saw my coworkers whom I hadn't seen in a long time. In the corner of the room, childhood friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Sarah's friends were here too, whom I rarely had contact with but knew their faces from various family and school events. I even saw Sarah's parents, who had traveled from out of town, especially to visit. All of these people had gathered here for me to wish me a happy birthday. There were over 30 people in the room, and every single one of them had come for the celebration my wife had spent so long planning. I couldn't believe what was happening. The balloons, the banners, the garlands all created an atmosphere of warmth and joy, but in that moment I felt like a complete fool. I stood with my phone in my hand, camera on, ready to catch Sarah cheating, but instead I witnessed her actually trying to organize the perfect surprise for me. Sarah walked over to me and, tilting her head slightly, asked quietly but with a good-natured smile, "Are you recording this?" I lowered my eyes to my phone and noticed with some embarrassment that the camera was still working. My paranoia had made me turn on the recording to capture evidence of her cheating, and now it just looked ridiculous. I turned off the recording, dropping my phone into my pocket, and sighed. Sarah put her arms around me and whispered, "You probably thought I was up to something, didn't you?" Her voice was full of softness and understanding. In that moment, I realized how deeply mistaken I had been. She was right. I had really thought she was hiding something, that her strange behavior, her late comings home, her meetings with John and Mark were connected to something bad. But now I saw the whole picture. She was just trying to organize something special for me, for our marriage and family. I looked back at the kids. Emma was nodding with a smile, Oliver was waving, and Lily ran up and hugged me tightly. "Daddy, we've been making this for so long," she said excitedly. You could feel the pride in her voice that it had gone the way they had planned. I laughed and hugged her back, realizing how preoccupied I had been with my gloomy thoughts and how little attention I had paid to the joyous events that were unfolding right under my nose. All of my friends and colleagues started coming up to me to congratulate me, each time expressing their good wishes and laughing at how beautifully Sarah had organized everything. John and Mark, approaching me with glasses in hand, gave me a friendly pat on the shoulder. "You should have seen your face when you walked in," John laughed. I shook my head, smiling, and felt the heaviness of all the fears I'd carried for the past weeks go away in my chest. It seemed like such nonsense now. I didn't even know how to react to it all. Everything that was happening was such a contrast to what I had expected. Mark, with his mischievous smile, was hard to miss. "Don't worry, Michael. We didn't suspect for a minute that you'd think anything wrong," he said, and I felt a slight warmth at his words. He had known me for a long time, and now I felt like I could trust him and John as I had before. No secrets, no suspicions, just old friends ready to share in my joy on this important day. The whole atmosphere of the evening was filled with fun and genuine joy. All my fears that I might have seen cheating or betrayal dissipated. Instead, I was surrounded by the closest people who had come to celebrate my birthday and make this moment special. I stood among them, feeling a wave of relief come over me, realizing that I had almost ruined something truly important with my mistrust. My wife, my children, my friends, they had all proven to be faithful and loving, and I had allowed my fears and paranoia to overshadow that. In that moment, I realized how lucky I was to have Sarah, who not only loved me, but was willing to go to such lengths for my happiness. I looked at Sarah, and she smiled at me again. I returned the favor, feeling a new wave of love and gratitude ignite inside. Once everyone was gathered around the big table, the laughter and conversation didn't stop for a minute. Everyone shared memories, jokes, toasts dedicated to my birthday. But despite all this atmosphere of celebration, I couldn't get rid of my thoughts about what had happened over the past few weeks. Sitting next to Sarah, watching her smile and laugh with our friends and children, I felt the realization slowly spill over in me of how wrong I had been. I remembered all the times I'd doubted her, the times I'd followed her at night, convincing myself that she was hiding something terrible. I remembered how anxiety made me worry every day that everything we'd built for all those 18 years was crumbling. But now, looking at her and our family and friends, I realized that she hadn't been thinking about herself or some secret life behind my back all this time, but only about how to make this day special for me. All her actions, all the meetings and conversations were all part of one big surprise that I almost ruined with my jealousy. I realized that my love for Sarah wasn't just strong, it was so deep that it was this feeling that made me so suspicious. I was afraid of losing her, and that fear poisoned my thoughts. I thought I was protecting myself and our marriage, but in reality, I let fear take over. But today, I saw that Sarah could be trusted, that her love for me was genuine and pure, and that my suspicions were completely unfounded. As the party began to wind down and the guests began to leave, I noticed that our children had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the fun. Sarah was standing smiling at the entrance to the living room, thanking and greeting the guests. I walked over to her, hugged her from behind, and felt her relax in my arms. "Thank you," I said quietly, hugging her tighter. She turned to me, her eyes glowing with tenderness. "For what?" she asked, her voice full of softness and warmth. "For all of this. For the holiday, for the surprise, and for doing so much for me, even when I was a complete idiot." I grinned slightly, trying to hide how much I was touched by the realization of all my mistakes. She laughed, stroked my cheek, and said, "You weren't an idiot. I knew you suspected something, but I didn't want to ruin the surprise." Her voice was so calm, as if she had forgiven me in advance for everything. "I thought I was losing you," I admitted, feeling that weight fall from my shoulders. "Thought you were cheating on me, and you've been making a holiday for me all this time." Sarah looked into my eyes, her gaze filled with understanding. "I've always thought only of you, Michael, all these years. I love you, and everything I've done is for us, for our family. Sometimes you think too much," she smiled softly, her words penetrating right into my heart. I realized that all my anxiety and fear was of my own making, and Sarah had never given me a reason to distrust her. "I realize that now," I said, trying to contain the excitement in my voice. "And I want you to know that I love you more than I ever have before. This day has shown me how much you care about me, and I won't let my fears ruin us." Sarah smiled, hugged me tightly, and said, "We've been through a lot, and I know you'll always be there for me. You just have to trust each other sometimes and not be afraid." I pulled her even tighter against me, feeling warmth spill over my body. It wasn't just a moment of reconciliation, it was a moment of new understanding, a new level of our love. I realized that trust and love had to come before anything else, that my fear of losing her was the biggest mistake of all. I now saw her not just as a wife, but as a partner who was willing to do anything for me, even when I doubted. In that minute, I realized how happy I was. This whole situation had not destroyed our marriage, but rather made it stronger. I was sure that now I would be able to understand Sarah better without making the same mistakes. After all, that was the most important thing, to trust and love. When the last guests had left and the children were asleep in their rooms, Sarah and I were alone in the silence of our home. I looked at her again, so dear, so loved. And although our relationship had always been strong, In that moment, I realized that my love for her had grown deeper. I realized that there may be many hardships and trials in our lives, but if there is trust and support for each other, no fears can keep us apart. "I love you," I said, looking into her eyes. Sarah smiled and replied, "I know. And I love you too." In that moment, everything that had happened over the past few weeks seemed so distant and unimportant. I stood with the woman I loved more than life, and now I knew that no doubts or fears could destroy what we had been building all these years. Dear friends, thank you so much for listening to this story till the end. If you like to listen to the best Reddit stories about relationships, stories about cheating wives, stories similar to Reddit stories, stories related to revenge for cheating, then subscribe to my channel. Have a nice day.